In the green heart of a farm forgotten over time, a bull named Bastião, a mountain of muscles and a contained fury, whose imposing presence was at one time the pride and fear of the small rural community. His black coat shone under the sun like polished obsidian, and his eyes, two deep puddles of melancholy, kept secrets that none of the farm workers could decipher. Bastion was a legend, a colossus of force that Arava the earth with a power that seemed to come from the bowels of the world, a giant who had never known defeat in any dispute of strength or resistance. However, 5 days ago, the giant is silence. A deep and inexplicable sadness had been slaughtered over him, a veil of agony that separated him from the world from the living. It refused the green hay, the crystal-clear water, the most select grains. His body, once a monument to vitality, was beginning to feel the weight of inanition, and concern grew like a weed in the hearts of those around him, transforming admiration into a constant whisper of apprehension and impotence. The legend was dying in silence, and no one knew why. The days dragged on heavy and hot, each marking a deepening of the mysterious Bastion disease. The farmer, a man with heated hands and hearts used to the hardness of life in the countryside, had already exhausted all his options. He had brought the veterinarian from the neighboring city, a renowned expert who examined the bull up and down, measuring his temperature, alarming his powerful heart, seeking any physical sign that could justify the refusal to feed. But the diagnosis was frustrating and enigmatic. Bastião was perfectly healthy. There was no fever, infection, or injury. The disease that afflicted him did not live in his flesh, but in a much deeper and more inaccessible place, a wound in the soul that no remedy or injection could achieve. Man, accustomed to practical solutions, felt lost in the face of a problem that escaped his understanding. He looked at his most valuable animal of all, and saw not only a bull, but a reflection of his own disability. A giant who was consumed for invisible and invincible sadness, a painful mystery in the center of his property. The news of Bastion's suffering spread like fire in dry straw around the surroundings. Neighbors and friends came to offer advice, each with a more fantastic theory than the other. Some said he was evil eye, the envy of someone who coveted the strength of the animal. Others suggested that perhaps the bull would miss a companion, that the loneliness of his greatness was finally consuming him. There were even those who brought a blessing, an advanced lady whose prayers and branches of Arava were the last hope for the desperate. She walked around the surroundings, muttering old words and making the sign of the cross, but Bastion remained motionless, her gaze lost on the horizon, indifferent to all rituals and attempts at healing. With each passing day, the bull sank more into his lethargy, and the silence in his corral became a deafening scream of pain. The community, once so certain of the laws of nature, has now been facing a riddle that challenged all logic and experience. The giant was giving up on life, and the world around him could only watch, powerless. Impotence was a corrosive feeling that undermined the morals of the workers. They loved Bastion, not only for their monetary value, but for what he represented: the brute force of nature, resilience, the indomitable spirit of the countryside. Seeing it to define it was like seeing a part of the soul of the farm died slowly. They tried everything. They cooked nutritious broths, mixed molasses in their feed, brought sweet and succulent fruits that once he devoured with eagerness. Each offer was received with the same and desolate indifference. The bull simply turned his head massive to the side, his deep, sad eyes fixed in a distant point that only he seemed to see. The refusal was passive but firm, an invisible barrier that he had erected with each other and the world. Frustration became despair, and conversations on the porch of the big house, once full of laughter and stories, were now dominated by a single and dark topic: the inexplicable regret of the silent giant who had chosen death instead of food. Bastion's corral, but a place of activity and admiration, became a sanctuary of sadness. The air was heavy, loaded with the expectation of the inevitable. The sun hit the dirt floor, but there seemed to be enough warmth to dispel the coldness emanating from the property bull. He spent hours on the same position, lying on the straw, his slow and superficial breathing. Sometimes a long, deep sigh escaped from his lungs, a sound that echoed through the valley as the regret of an old and forgotten creature. It was the only sound he emitted, a monologue of pain that no one could interpret. The other animals on the farm seemed to feel their agony. Cows changed lower way, the chickens scratched with less enthusiasm. An abnormal stillness had settled, as if all life around were in advance of the impending loss of his silent and misunderstood king. The whole farm held her breath, waiting for a miracle or the end. The fifth night arrived, bringing a pale moon with it and a cold wind that whispered omens between the leaves of the trees. The farmer made his last visit of the day to the corral. He took a flashlight and the heavy heart of defeat. He found Bastion exactly as he had left him, a statue of suffering under the silver moonlight. He sat on a nearby trunk at a respectful distance and spoke to the bull low, not as an owner, but as an old friend. He told him about the harvest, about concerns about drought, about the small joys of the day. His words were an attempt to make a bridge over the abyss of silence that separated them. But there was no answer. Bastion remained in his shadow world, deaf to any appeal. The man sighed, the vapor of his breath mingling with the darkness. She was exhausted, overdue. That animal, symbol of all his struggle and work, was surrendering. And he, with all his strength and will, could do absolutely nothing to prevent. That same night, Bastion agony became almost palpable. He didn't sleep. His eyes remained open, fixed in the darkness, as if he was waging an internal battle against invisible demons. The wind howled, bringing with it the nocturnal sounds of the farm. But to the bull, everything was a distant and meaningless noise. Hunger was no longer the main cause of his suffering. It was just a symptom of a much older and deep pain, a traumatic memory that had reactivated itself in his mind and now paralyzed him. He was reliving a terror of the past, a loss, a cruelty that had left scars in his spirit. And in his loneliness, there was no one who could understand or relieve this load. The outer world, with its food offerings and empty words, was unable to touch the origin of his pain. He was alone in his maze of fear, and the only way out he could see was the end of everything. The surrender was imminent. The morning of the sixth day dawned gray and without promises. Hope had been gone almost completely. The decision was already being considered, the most terrible of all, the sacrifice. It would be an act of mercy, some said, to end the prolonged suffering of the animal. The farmer postponed the thought, but the idea infiltrated his mind like a slow poison. How could he put an end to the life of the creature he admired so much? The issue hovered in the air, heavy and inevitable. Bastion's fate seemed sealed, a rural tragedy about to materialize. The giant, who had lived as a king, would die without anyone ever knew the reason for his deep sadness. The story of his strength would forever be haunted by the mystery of his final weakness. The farm was preparing for morning, for the definitive silence that would follow the last sigh of the indomitable bull, a giant who succumbed not to a body disease, but a silent soul. and it was in this scenario of desolation, when all the doors seemed closed and the fate of Bastion was one step to be sealed by the hand of man, that a new and unexpected possibility arose on the horizon. A small light amid overwhelming darkness. The news of the dying bull had traveled beyond the fences of the farm, beyond the hills and valleys, reaching the ears of someone who did not see the world with the eyes, but with the heart. Someone who did not know the logic of adults or the practicality of farmers, but who had a sensitivity capable of hearing the whispers that the wind carried. An unlikely presence was on its way, bringing with it a different way of seeing and a hope that no one else dared to have. The giant's agony had echoed so far that he had reached the only soul that might truly understand it, and perhaps heal it. The final chapter of the story of Bastion was not yet written. Far from the farm and its atmosphere of despair, in a small house of village nestled between rosewood trees, a girl named Lyra lived. She was 10 years old, and a smile that seemed to carry all the sunlight, a light she herself had never seen. Lyra was blind from birth, a detail that, for many, could define her existence, but which for her was just a feature, such as the color of her hair or the sound of her laugh. Lyra's world was not made of colors and shapes, but textures, sounds, smells, and, above all, feelings. His fingers were his eyes, able to read the stories recorded in the bark of a tree or the fabric of a dress. His ears captured the most subtle nuances of a voice, distinguishing the joy of sadness, the truth of lies. She saw the world in a way that people with vision would never get. She saw the essence of things, the soul behind appearance, the silent music that connects all living beings. Lyra sailed for life with a grace and confidence that disconcerted adults. The history of the Basin bull arrived in Lyra through his grandfather, an old storyteller who visited the farm occasionally to buy cheese and prosecate. He told about the magnificent animal, its legendary strength, and its inexplicable hunger strike, describing the sadness that hovered over the place. While the others in the room swung their heads with pity and worry, Lyra was silent, her head tilted as if hearing something no one else could hear. She didn't just hear the story of a sick bull. She heard a call. In his mind, a non-visual image of the Bastion was formed, an image made with the feelings of loneliness, fear, and pain that his grandfather's words carried. She felt the giant's agony as if it were yours. An inexplicable connection formed in her heart, a certainty that she needed to go to him. "I want to see him, Grandpa," she said, her small but full of unshakable conviction. "I think I can help you." His parents exchanged a look of concern and tenderness, fearing for the safety and inevitable disappointment of his daughter. Lyra's insistence was kind but persistent. She could not explain the logic behind her desire. It was a thrust that came from a deep place, a powerful intuition that had always guided her. For her, the suffering of the Bastion was not a problem to be solved with medicine or logic, but a pain to be welcomed. His parents, although skeptical and apprehensive, knew the special nature of their daughter. They knew that her perception of the world was unique, and that she often felt things that went unnoticed to all others. After much deliberation, and with his grandfather's promise that he would guarantee her safety all the time, they agreed. The trip to the farm was marked by a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Lyra remained silent for most of her way, her small hands resting on her lap, her serene face turned to the window, as if she could feel the landscape passing through her. She was not going to find a dangerous animal. He was going to meet a soul that, like her, lived in a different kind of darkness and needed someone to understand his language. Upon reaching the farm, the heavy atmosphere was almost suffocating. The farmer, with his face marked by exhaustion and grief, received them with a tired courtesy, but his gaze filled with unbelief as he saw the little blind girl. The idea that she could succeed where everyone had failed seemed absurd, almost an insult to her pain. However, there was something in Lyra's serenity that disarmed him. She showed no fear, just a calm and focused determination. "Where is he?" she asked gently, and her voice, clear like a bell, seemed to cut for a moment the shroud of sadness that covered the place. The grandfather held his hand tightly, describing in a low voice the way to the corral, the wooden fence, the ground floor, the immense and immovable figure of the bull lying in the background. Lyra absorbed each word, building the scenario in her mind, preparing not for a vision, but for an encounter of spirits, a conversation that would transcend vision and sound. The group walked slowly to the enclosure. The nearby workers stopped their tasks, watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The image of a fragile, blind girl approaching the corral of a known bull known for her unpredictable temperament was of a frightening incongruity. The farmer felt a chill, an urge to interrupt it all, to protect the child from the inevitable disappointment or worse, from a real danger. Bastion, even weakened, was still an immensely powerful animal. A sudden movement, irritation access, and the tragedy would be instantaneous. But Lyra's grandfather put a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of trust. "Leave it," he whispered. "She knows what she does." There was a faith in his eyes that challenged logic, a belief in his granddaughter's ability to see what all of them, with his perfect vision, were unable to see. The world seemed to arrest his breath as Lyra arrived on the brink. Lyra stopped by the wooden fence, her small hands finding the rough and familiar texture of the sun aged by the sun and the rain. She could smell dry straw, earth, and the altor and heavy odor of the large animal. And I could feel something more, a wave of sadness so deep and overwhelming that it was almost a physical presence in the air. She took a deep breath, focusing on, ignoring the worried whispers of adults behind her. For Lyra, there was no monster there, just a living being immersed in a suffering she recognized. It was the same loneliness she sometimes felt in her own silent and dark world, the feeling of being trapped in a reality that no one could understand. She lifted her face toward Bastion, her eyes without fixed vision, where she felt the concentration of that pain. She didn't see a bull. He saw a broken heart, and his own heart was filled with pure and overwhelming compassion. "Can I come in?" asked Lyra, his voice no longer than a whisper addressed to the farmer. The man hesitated, the panic fighting against the strange sense of hope that the girl's calm inspired. He looked at his grandfather, who only nodded. With his heart in his mouth, the farmer opened the corral gate, a tall creak that seemed to desecrate the stillness of the place. Bastion, for the first time in days, moved his massive head toward the sound, his opaque and disinterested eyes vaguely fixed on the small figure that now entered his domain. An alarm murmur toured the viewers. That was crazy. But Lyra walked into the corral with a quiet confidence, her bare feet feeling the dirt floor, each step deliberate and without hesitation. She was not invading a territory. He was entering a sacred space of suffering, and did so with the respect of those who enter a temple. The girl who saw with her heart was about to find the soul giant wounded. She stopped a few meters from the bull, a distance that seemed safe to the others, but to her was already of deep intimacy. She could feel the heat radiating from the animal's massive body, could hear her slow, laborious breathing. She didn't speak immediately. It just stood there in silence, offering his presence as a calm anchor in the midst of the storm of Bastião agony. It was a form of communication that it dominated, the language of shared silence, of mutual respect. She was letting the bull feel her, to realize she was not a threat, that she didn't come with needles, medicines, or demands. She came only like herself, a little soul that recognized the pain of another. For a long minute, which seemed eternity, the two beings remained like this, a giant lying down and a girl standing. A blind man with body and one, connected by an invisible wire of empathy that was beginning to weave in the heavy air of the corral. Finally, Lyra took another step, and then another. It moved with the lightness of a leaf in the wind, without making any abrupt sound. The adults arrested their breath, their hearts beating. She approached until she was by the colossal head of Bastion, so close she could touch her massive horns. She slowly knelt on her straw, and her little hand extended, not with hesitation, but with a kind certainty. His fingers, his eyes, touched the rough coat of the bull's face, feeling the vibration of his life, the tension in his muscles, the tremor of his contained pain. Bastion did not move, did not react. It just remained there, allowing the touch, maybe feeling for a long time, in a long time, a presence that wanted nothing of it, just offer comfort. And then Lyra leaned forward, her lips near the big Turo ear, preparing to share a secret, a truth that only her heart could know, and perhaps, only perhaps, could bring the giant back from the abyss. The noon sun was the pin, shed a merciless light on the corral, turning the scene into a maximum tension stage. All eyes were fixed on Lyra's unlikely figure, kneeling beside the head of the Bastion bull. The silence was absolute, broken only by the tinnitus distant from a fly and the heavy breathing of the dying animal. The farmer held the hat with both hands, rooting the tad with nervousness, his face a mask of unbelief and fear. Lyra's grandfather, though he appeared calm, had his fists clenched, a silent prayer on his lips, every second stretched by an eternity. Lyra's hand rested softly on the Bastion's cheek, a point of contact that seemed to carry a huge weight, a fragile bridge over an abyss of despair. The bull, which had been near death, remained strangely receptive to the girl's touch, her great eyes still opaque, but perhaps with a brightness of curiosity in the depths of her melancholy. The little blind girl, in her innocence and wisdom, was in the epicenter of a moment that challenged all logic and experience. She leaned, her dark hair falling over her face as she approached her lips to the hairy ear of a Bastion. The viewers leaned forward instinctively, as if they could hear what would be said, although they knew it was impossible. What could a child tell a bull that veterinarians and experts could not achieve? What magical words could she possess? The expectation was palpable, an electricity in the air. Lyra closed her eyes, not that she made a difference to her vision, but to focus even more, to completely dive into the world of feelings emanating from the animal. She felt his fear, an ancient fear, a memory of pain that haunted him. And he also felt his strength, his nobility, now buried under layers of suffering. It was not going to offer a diagnosis or a solution. It was going to offer recognition. He was going to give voice to the suffering he could not express. And with hot breath against the bull's skin, she began to whisper. His words were inaudible to others, a soft murmur taken by the wind, a secret shared only between her and the giant. They were not words of command or supplication. They were words of empathy. "I know," she whispered, her voice a balm. "I know you're scared. I know it hurts. Someone hurt you a long time ago, didn't you? It took something you loved a lot. And now the pain came back. You're not alone in the dark, Bastion. I am afraid sometimes, But darkness is not the end. This strength is still there. Let the pain go. His words were simple, straightforward, born of an intuitive and deep understanding of the source of bull pain. She didn't speak for long. It was just a few moments, but in those moments, a universe of understanding was exchanged. When he finished speaking, Lyra didn't move away. He remained there with his hand on his face, his forehead almost touching his, offering the continuous comfort of his presence. And then something happened, a subtle but unmistakable change. A tremor ran through the massive body of Bastion. It was not a tremor of weakness, but of liberation. A long, long breath came out of his lungs, but this was different from the previous laments. It seemed like a sigh of relief, of surrender to something that was not death, but healing. Slowly, with an effort that seemed monumental, the bull moved his head. He did not move away from Lyra. On the contrary, he tilted his massive head toward her, and a low, guttural sound, almost a murmur, vibrated in his chest. And then, to the absolute astonishment of all, his long, rough tongue came out and licked the little hand of the girl who was still resting on her face. A collective hiccup of amazement and relief escaped the viewer's lips. The farmer dropped his hat on the floor, his wide, damp eyes. Lyra's grandfather smiled, a large, radiant smile that lit his wrinkled face. That gesture, that lick, was an answer. It was acceptance. It was gratitude. It was the first act of communication coming from Bastion in almost a week. Lyra smiled too, a smile of pure joy. She didn't need to see to know what had happened. She felt the change in the animal's energy, the dissipation of tension, the return of a life pulse. She gently stroked the bull's muzzle, whispering words of comfort and affection, no more secrets, but affirmations of friendship. The wounded giant had been touched. The sick soul had been reached. The words whispered in the wind, born of the heart of a blind girl, had operated a miracle that no science or strength could perform. Lyra got up slowly, still keeping in touch with Bastion, as if she were afraid to break the charm. She turned to the farmer, her small, serene face shining. "He's hungry now," she said, with a simplicity that denied the magnitude of what had just happened. The still stunned farmer took a second to process the words. Then, as if aroused the trance, he shouted orders to his men. "Fast! Bring the best hay, fresh water, the special ration!" There was a frantic race, an explosion of activity, where there was only one waiting resigned to death. In a few minutes, a lot of fresh and aromatic hay was placed in front of Bastion, along with a bucket of clean water. Lyra remained inside the corral, at a short distance, her presence a silent guarantee for the bull. All the others watched outside the fence, their hearts beating hard on expectation. Bastion looked at the food. He hesitated for a moment, as if he was remembering how to do something he had forgotten. He looked at Lyra, and she nodded softly, as if she could see him and encourage him with his eyes. And then, slowly, he rose. It was a visible effort. His legs trembled under the weight of his weakened body, but he fell, standing for the first time in days. He was a magnificent view, even in his thinness, a king recovering his throne. He stepped toward the hill of hay, lowered his massive head and, to the uncontrolled joy of all, began to eat. The first bites were slow, hesitant, but soon he was devouring the food with a voracious hunger, the hunger of those who return from the threshold of death. The sound of his chewing was the most beautiful song that the farmer had ever heard. Tears ran freely through his face, tears of gratitude, relief, and deep admiration for the little and extraordinary girl who had come to save her giant. The whispered secret in the wind was not a magical formula, but the most fundamental of all truths, that all pain, no matter how great, yearnings for being recognized. Lyra didn't heal the Bastion with a magic pass. She healed him with empathy. She validated her suffering, gave her a name, and offered her a safe haven in her presence. She reminded him of his own strength and gave him permission to let the pain of the past. To the others, it seemed like a miracle, and maybe it was. But it was a miracle born of the human connection, or rather, from the connection between living beings. A powerful demonstration that the true cure for soul wounds is not in medicine, but in love, understanding, and the courage to enter the darkness of the other and simply say, "I know, and I am here." While Bastion ate, recovering his forces every bit, Lyra remained in her post, a silent guardian. She didn't need applause or thanks. His reward was the sound of life returning, the feeling of peace that now emanating from the bull. The friendship between the girl who saw with the heart and the giant who had been healed by her words was sealed. The bond was invisible, but stronger than any current. The secret she whispered would remain a mystery to others, a popular tale to be passed from generation to generation on the farm. But for Lyra and Bastion, it was the foundation of a mutual understanding, proof that the most powerful words are not those that are shouted to the world, but those who are whispered from one heart to another, loaded by the wind, capable of healing the most tormented souls and making hope in the most arid places. What followed the first bit of Bastion hay was nothing less than a celebration. The news spread across the farm like a gunpowder, and soon a small crowd gathered near the corral, maintaining a respectful distance, but with fixed eyes on the scene that many would later describe as a real miracle. The bull, which a few hours earlier it was an impending death image, now ate with an appetite that seemed to want to compensate every day of Onion. After running out the hill of hay, he plunged his muzzle into the bucket of water and drank long and deeply, the sound of his headquarters being satiated like a victory anthem. The farmer, with red eyes of emotion, approached Lyra and his grandfather, unable to articulate words that could express the immensity of his gratitude. He simply hugged the old friend and then knelt before Lyra, taking his little hand and depositing a respectful kiss, a gesture of the humble man in the face of wisdom he did not understand, but who had saved his most precious good. From that day, a new routine settled. Lyra became a daily visitor on the farm. Every afternoon, her grandfather took her there, and the ritual was repeated. She entered the corral, where Bastion was now waiting for her with a calm expectation. He was no longer the rise and melancholy animal. As soon as she felt Lyra's presence, her massive head lifted and a low, soft murmur vibrated in her chest, a greeting that was reserved for her only. The girl spent hours with her new friend. She sat next to her as he ate, told him stories about his world of sounds and smells, or simply silent, sharing a company that didn't need words. She ran her hands through her coat, feeling the strength that returned to her muscles, and he restrained his giant head near her, in a gesture of absolute trust and affection. The bond between them was a vision that continued to marvel everyone on the farm. The transformation of the Bastion was complete and astonishing. In a few weeks, he not only recovered all the lost weight, but it seemed more vibrant and powerful than ever. His coat shines again with the obsidian chandelier, and his eyes, once puddles of despair, now shone with intelligence and a newly discovered serenity. He returned to work in the fields, but something had changed. His strength seemed now seasoned by a new kindness. He was more docile with workers, more cooperative, as if the note of anger and fear inside had been permanently disadvantaged by Lyra's intervention. The aggressiveness that was once part of its indomitable nature had dissipated, replaced by a majestic calm. He's still a king, a giant among the animals, but now he ruled his little world with a peace that was once unknown to him. The strength he displayed was no longer just gross, but it came from a place of inner balance. The friendship between the blind girl and the giant bull became the legend of the region. People from neighboring villages came to the farm, not as tourists, but as pilgrims, to witness the extraordinary scene. They watched from a distance, in reverent silence, while Lyra, such a small and fragile figure, interacted with the mountain of muscles that was a Bastion. He saw her laugh as he tickled her with the muzzle. They saw her lie down and use her massive hip like a hot pillow while telling stories. They were scenes that challenged logic and touched the hearts of all who saw them. History served as a living parable about the power of compassion and connection. It showed that true strength does not reside in the ability to dominate, but in the courage to be vulnerable and the ability to see beyond appearances, to feel the pain of the other, and to offer comfort without judgment. For Lyra, the friendship with Bastion opened a new universe. Although he had always been a happy child, the bond with the bull gave him a new sense of purpose and belonging. With him, she was not the blind girl. She was simply Lyra, Bastion's friend. He did not judge her for her inability to see. He completely accepted her, responding to her kindness with unshakable loyalty. His confidence in it was absolute. Often the farmer found them dormant together in the corral, the little girl nestled in safe against the huge body of the bull, an image of peace and confidence so pure that she seemed sacred. This friendship gave the Lyra a new inner strength, a confirmation that its unique way of perceiving the world was not a disability, but a gift, a powerful tool for healing and connection. The farmer, in turn, was a transformed man. The experience humiliated him and taught him more about life than all his hard work years. He has learned to look at his animals not only as goods or tools, but as sentient beings with his own emotions and stories. He began to pay more attention to subtle signs, looks, behavioral changes. He became a more patient, more kind, more attuned to the rhythm of nature around him. The gratitude I felt for Lyra was immense and eternal. He insisted on sharing part of the farm's profits with the girl's family, ensuring that she had everything she needed, but her biggest gift was the promise that Bastion would belong to Lyra forever. He would never be sold, would never be sent away. He would remain there on the farm as the living symbol of a miracle and the best friend of an extraordinary girl. The strength of that unlikely bond radiated beyond the two. The atmosphere on the farm changed. The workers, inspired by the example, became kinder with each other and with the animals. Conversations on the porch were now often about the intelligence and sensitivity of the creatures around them. Bastion's corral, before a place of fear and after despair, became the heart of the farm, a place where people went to feel alone, to observe the pure friendship between the girl and the bull, and remember the simple and deep truths of life. The corral miracle was not a unique and isolated event. It was the beginning of a new way of seeing and living for the whole community, a wave of compassion that began with a whisper and spread, transforming everything that touched. The years could pass, Lyra would grow, and Bastion would grow old, but the story of her friendship would be immortal. It would be told to children at bedtime, a tale about how the greatest darkness can be illuminated by the smallest of lights, and how wild hearts can be tamed, not by force, but by love. The image of the two together, the girl guided by the heart and the bull guided by her loyalty to her, would be engraved in the collective memory of that place. It was living proof that the strongest connections are often the most unexpected, forged not in similarities, but in the mutual acceptance of differences. The bond between them was a silent testimony that there is no abyss so great that empathy cannot cross, nor wound so deep that friendship cannot heal. The miracle in the end was not Bastion to have eaten again. The real miracle was the revelation of a universal truth through that event, that all beings, human or not, share the same fundamental need to be seen, heard, and understood. Lyra, with her physical blindness, saw the soul of Bastion with a blinding clarity, and Bastion, in his silent pain, found a voice and a refuge in the girl's presence. Together, they redefined the meaning of strength, healing, and friendship. They did not need an audience or external validation. Their world was complete in shared silence, gentle touch, and mutual understanding. The unexpected strength of his unlikely bond became a legend, a lighthouse of hope that would continue to shine long after his footprints had disappeared from the corral's soft land. To completely understand the depth of the miracle that Lyra operated, it was necessary to go back in time, to dig up the roots of the pain of the Bastion, the shadows of a past that haunted him and had left invisible scars in his spirit. Bastion was not born on that peaceful farm. Its history had begun in a very different place, a large property of elite cattle breeding, where animals were not seen as beings, but as goods, genetic investments whose value was measured in pedigree and profit potential. He had been born from a champion lineage, and from an early age had been separate from his mother, a standard and cruel procedure in these commercial operations. That first break, the call desperate for his mother who was never answered, was the first wound, the first trauma knot that formed in his young soul. He early learned that affection was a weakness, and that vulnerability led to loss. In that first home, life was a succession of strict training and isolation. His extraordinary strength was noted early, and he was prepared not to plow fields, but for the arenas, for the competitions of strength and display. His keeper was a hard and impatient man who saw kindness as a defect to be corrected. Communication was done through strength, punishment, a sharp hook that constantly reminding him who was in charge. Bastion learned to suppress his instinct, to hide his fear behind a facade of aggressiveness. He became the magnificent and indomitable animal that everyone saw, but inside, the frightened calf he had been separated from his mother still shaking. Each victory in the arena, every applause of the crowd, just reinforced its loneliness. He was admired for his strength, but no one saw the price he paid for her. His soul was filled with scars, one for every scream of the carrier, each day of isolation, every memory of the lost mother. The event that broke his spirit, however, was even more traumatic. On that farm, there was a single being that had offered him a glimpse of kindness, an old pastor dog at the end of his life, who lapsed from one leg and was considered useless by the owners. The dog, perhaps feeling the loneliness of the young bull, used to lie down outside his surroundings, offering a silent company. Over time, a silent bond formed between them. Bastião was waiting for the dog's visit every day, and the calm presence of the old animal was the only balm for his tormented soul. It was a secret friendship, a small point of light in his dark life. The dog was the only thing he loved, the only connection that was not stained by pain or fear. It was your substitute family, your safe haven. One day during a violent storm, lightning hit a tree near the barn, which caught fire quickly. Panic settled. Men ran to save the most valuable cattle, and in the middle of chaos, smoke, and shouts, Bastião saw his only friend, the old pastor dog, trapped inside one of the flames. With a roar of fury and despair, he broke over his corral, a demonstration of force that shocked everyone, and ran toward the fire. But it was too late. He was hindered by men who feared him to get hurt and lose his value. He was forced to watch, powerless, while the place where his friend was consumed by the flames. The smell of smoke, the sound of the crackling wood, and the desperate scream he gave that night were forever recorded in his memory. He had not lost just a friend. He had lost the only proof that love and kindness existed in his world. After the fire, Bastião became uncontrollable. The pain of loss has become a blind and destructive anger. He who was the pride of the farm became a danger, a volatile and unpredictable asset. The keeper tried to subdue him with even more violence, but this only worsened the situation. Finally, considered a lost cause, a failed investment, it was sold for a low price to the good-hearted farmer who would become his second and last owner. On the new farm, he found peace and respectful treatment for the first time in his life. Gradually, the quiet routine and the absence of cruelty allowed the scars of their past to begin to close. He channeled his strength to work, and his anger fell asleep, buried in the depths of his memory. He became the Bastion that everyone knew, the powerful but melancholy giant. The shadows of the past were still there, but he had learned to live with them. So what happened so that the pain would come back so hard? It was a seemingly banal event. A few days before stopping eating, a group of hunters passed through the region, and one of its bars, poorly erased, rekindled at night, creating a small fire in a distant part of the farm. The fire was quickly controlled and did not represent real danger. But the smell of smoke that the wind brought to the Bastion corral was the trigger. That specific odor, mixed with the darkness of the night, transported him instantly back to that terrible night of his youth. The dormant trauma woke up with overwhelming violence. In his mind, he was no longer at the safe farm. He was back in hell of fire, reliving the loss of his only friend, his impotence, his overwhelming pain. The refusal to eat was not a disease. It was a reactivated mourning, a manifestation of post-traumatic stress so deep that it paralyzed it. That's what Lyra felt. When she knelt beside him and touched her face, her heart did not feel a sick bull, but a soul attached to a terrifying memory. She did not know the details, the dog or the fire, but her empathy allowed her to feel the essence of trauma, fear, loss, loneliness. And that is why his words were so powerful. When she whispered, "I know you're afraid. Someone hurt you a long time ago. They took something you loved a lot." She was giving voice to the deepest secret of Bastion. She was validating her pain, telling her that what he felt was real and that she saw him. And when she said, "You're safe now. No one will hurt you anymore, I promise," she was breaking the trauma cycle. She was anchoring him in the present, taking him out of the terrifying memory and bringing him back to the safety of the corral and his kind presence. Lyra's whisper was the antidote to the poison of the past. His security promise was what he had to hear to believe the nightmare was over. The lick he gave in his hand was not just a thank you. It was a recognition that she had understood her story without her having to tell her. She had looked through the layers of strength and aggressiveness and seen the scared calf inside. She did not try to fix it. She simply welcomed him. The miracle was not to erase the scars of the past. The scars, after all, are part of who we are. The miracle was to show the Bastion that he no longer needed to be defined by them. Lyra did not offer him oblivion, but liberation. She showed her that it was possible to carry the marks of pain without being her prisoner. Bastion's story was a dark reminder that the deepest wounds are often invisible to the naked eye. The spirit, like the body, can be injured, and these injuries, if not treated with compassion and understanding, can get sick and kill. Bastion was lucky enough to find Lyra, a healer of souls who, with his unique perception, was able to diagnose and treat a wound that no one else could see. Its history is a testimony of the resilience of the spirit, but also of its fragility. It shows how trauma can remain asleep for years, waiting for a trigger to resurface in full force. And it reveals that healing often does not come from great gestures or complex solutions, but from a simple act of recognition, the soft voice that says, "I see your pain, and you are not alone." The shadows of the past can be long and dark, but even the smallest empathy light can show the way out of them. The awakening of hope on the farm was not a sudden event, but a gradual flourishing, like a field that receives the first rain after a long drought. It began with the sound of the Bastion chewing the hay, a sound that became the new soundtrack of the property, a constant reminder that despair had been won. But the true transformation was deeper. Hope was not only in the physical recovery of the bull, but in the rediscovery of a fundamental truth that the routine and the difficulties of life in the countryside had overshadowed, that love, in its most varied forms, is the most essential food of all. Bastião did not start eating because the hay was tasty, but because the love and understanding that Lyra offered him awakened again his will to live. He fed her acceptance before feeding on the grain. It was the affection that reopened his appetite for life. This new consciousness has infiltrated every corner of the farm. The farmer, but a man focused on productivity and results, began to spend more time with his animals, not just to feed them or take care of his physical needs, but to simply be with them. He learned to recognize his personalities, his moods, his little joys. He spoke to them, not as a master, but as a guardian, and found that this connection, this exchange of affection, brought much greater satisfaction than any abundant harvest. Hope for him has become the joy of seeing life prospering not only in his fields, but in the hearts and spirits of creatures under his care. The farm, which was once a business, became a home. A community interconnected by ties of respect and mutual affection. The friendship between Lyra and Bastion became the epicenter of this awakening. Each afternoon, the scene of his silent and loving interaction served as a living lesson for all. They were proof that the deepest communication transcends words and appearances. Lyra, who couldn't see the size of Bastion, didn't fear him. Bastion, who could not understand Lyra's words in the literal sense, perfectly understood the language of her heart. The hope they personified was the hope of a world where barriers that separate beings, whether physical, such as blindness, or species, such as a human and a bull, could be dissolved by empathy. They taught everyone who looked that, to truly connect with another being, you don't have to look at him, but inside him. Time has passed, and the stations changed the farm scenario, but the bond between Lyra and Bastion only deepened. He became his protector, confidant, his adventure companion. She explored the farm with a confidence she had never had before, often guided by the smooth touch of the Bastion muzzle on her back. He, in turn, found in her the peace he had never known. Lyra's presence was her anchor, her constant reminder that she was safe and loved. The shadows of his past never completely disappeared. Like the scars, they were part of their story. But now it was just that, shadows, without power to obscure the bright light of his present. Hope, for him, was the sound of Lyra's steps approaching, the certainty that every day he would find kindness and understanding. Their story has become more than one local legend. It became a symbol of hope for many who heard it. People who faced their own silent battles, their own trauma and sorrows, found comfort and inspiration in the tale of the blind girl and the injured bull. History reminded them that healing is possible, that the connection can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the power of a simple act of kindness should never be underestimated. The awakening of hope that began in the Basin Corral spread far beyond their fences, playing hearts and minds, encouraging people to look at each other and the world around them with a little more of Lyra's perception. For Lyra, the awakening of hope was the discovery of his own power. She learned that her disability was actually her greatest strength. Her inability to see the outside world forced her to develop an inner view of extraordinary clarity. She understood that her purpose in life was not to overcome her blindness, but to use her to help others see more clearly. His friendship with Bastion was just the beginning. She grew up to become a woman whose wisdom and compassion were sought by many, a healer of souls who used empathy as her main instrument. She taught many that love is not just a feeling, but an action, a conscious choice to connect with the pain of the other and offer a safe space for healing. The climax of history is not a big event, but a simple and eternal scene. On a golden fall of autumn, many years later, Lyra, now a young woman, is sitting under the same large tree near the corral, leaning against the massive and aged body as a Bastion. He is old, his movements are slow, but his eyes are full of deep peace. She is reading to him, her fingers sliding over the pages of a book in Braille, her soft voice by mixing with the sound of the wind on the leaves. It doesn't matter that he doesn't understand the words. He understands the music of his voice, love in his touch. This scene is the embodiment of the awakening of hope, proof that time does not diminish true ties, and that love, once found, continues to nourish and support for a lifetime. The true food that saved Bastion and which transformed everyone around him did not come from the earth, but from the heart. It was the understanding that in the end, we are all injured, one way or another, seeking connection and acceptance. The story of Lyra and Bastion is a timeless testimony that when we offer unconditional love, we arouse hope not only in the other, but also in ourselves. Love becomes the bread of each day, the water that quenches the thirst of the soul, the only nutrient capable of healing the wounds that no other medicine can touch. It is the recognition that, to really live, we need to feed as well as to be fed by this invisible and almighty force. Thus, the legend of the bull that refused to eat and the blind girl who saved him with a whisper lives forever, not like a fairy tale, but as a guide that teaches us to look beyond visible, to hear what is not said, and to find the courage to offer our hearts as food to another being. The awakening of hope is a continuous process, a daily choice of believing in goodness, practicing empathy, and recognizing that the most powerful bond of the universe is, and always will be, love. In the quiet silence of that farm, Lyra and Bastion not only saved each other, they illuminated a way so that everyone could find their own awakening, their own inexhaustible source of essential food. For days, a colossal bull, the pride of a farm, was on the brink of death, refusing all kinds of food. Veterinarians and experts were perplexed. His body was healthy, but his spirit seemed to have given up. Hope had gone, and a terrible decision hovered in the air. What could be behind this strike of silent and deadly hunger? What if the answer was not in science or strength, but in something much deeper? The news came to a 10-year-old blind girl who felt an inexplicable call to find the suffering animal. Against all the logic and fear of adults, she entered the giant's corral. What happened below challenges any explanation. She approached the creature of almost a ton and whispered something in her ear. Instantly, a miracle unfolded before everyone's eyes. But what did she say? What secret a girl who has never seen the world shared to bring a giant back from the abyss? This is the story of a bond that transcends vision and reveals the healing power of a whispered secret.